Yeah, hello to you again. It's a pleasure to be here with you and see so many well-known and new faces. We are here for our next invited speaker, that is Shelley Anderson. And Shelley is also a very dear friend for many, many years. Her pronouns are she and her. And she has worked for over 3 decades in international peace movements, organizing and researching training in gender-sensitive active non-violence. In 2005, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize as part of the 1,000 Women for the Nobel Peace Prize initiative. That was very new for me. Thank you for telling me that, Shelley. She's a Zen Buddhist and a lay member of the Order of Interbeing. And Shelley will speak about possibilities of Buddhist peacemaking. Welcome with me, Shelley Anderson. Thank you. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, well, I'm Shelley. My pronouns are she and her, and I identify as a lesbian. I'll try to speak slowly, and if I am using words you don't understand, or if I speak too quickly, maybe you can raise your hand in the chat box, and I will try to slow down. In 1997, I was part of a group that organized a conference for peace women activists in Thailand. We brought together about 250 women who are active in social change movements and peace movements to exchange ideas and inspirations and tools. There was a peace researcher there. And somehow, when I was talking with her, the subject came up of queer Buddhist. And when I said that, her mouth dropped open and she said, in total amazement, "There's no such thing." So I want to thank everyone here, and especially the organizers, for bringing us together and increasing visibility for queer Buddhists, because we do exist. I'm going to try to share a PowerPoint presentation. Let's see. This is not working. Now that works. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a particular experiment in peace building that I was involved in. And I want to tie into this also some thoughts about Buddhism and peace building and the connection between queer Buddhist and peace building. So the experiment I was talking about was called the Women Peacemakers program. And this ran from 1997 to 2015. And the bulk of our work was training women in active nonviolence. We also, for the first 4 years, we organized regional consultations for women peace activists. So we would organize this. We organized one for European activists, for African activists, Latin American activists, Asian activists, and Pacific activists. And we would bring women from opposite sides of violent conflicts together. to, again, not to talk specifically about their conflict that they were involved in, but more to share what was working in their peace work, what wasn't working, what did they need to do their work more efficiently and more successfully. We also did a lot of documentation and analysis, because one thing I learned from this first 4 years of consultations with women peacemakers, women are doing incredible work, and the vast majority of the activists themselves and the work they're doing is invisible. That particularly in the late 1990s, people were not documenting this and looking at what was going on. We also felt that we needed to look at our own organizations that we were in and what they were doing around engendering their programs, making them more woman-friendly, talking about gender. So that's some of the outline of the work that we did. Most of my work in this, I did a lot of active nonviolence training. And for those of you who might not have participated in a training in active nonviolence, this would include a history of nonviolent ideas, case studies like India's independence movement, the US civil rights movement, people power in the Philippines, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and local cases of active nonviolence. We also tried to provide some tools for the participants and also to share the tools that they already had. And how do you analyze a conflict? How do you find out what are the roots of this conflict? What's keeping the violence going? And where can you most effectively intervene? There were two parts of our trainings that at the time, not many other groups were doing. And we would always talk about the role of religion in conflicts and in peace building, and the role of gender. Most of the peace organizations that I worked with were actually Christian. I've never worked for a Buddhist peace organization, and I would really love to. So a lot of the analysis and a lot of the written trainings were really based on Christian ideas of active nonviolence. We tried to expand that. Sometimes we worked with groups of women who were primarily Christian. Sometimes we worked with mixed groups of women who were secular, who were Muslim, who were Christian or Buddhist or Hindu. Sometimes we would work with Buddhist groups. And we always would look at this religion's role in the conflict. Were religious leaders or were religious ideas or identities part of the conflict? Were they being used to increase the violence, increase the conflict? Were particular groups being targeted? But we also would talk about religion as a source of peace building and of resolving violent conflict. Whenever we brought up the question of religion in these trainings, it was always a double-edged sword, excuse the metaphor, for particular women. Because many women found their personal beliefs and faith very inspiring, and they were actually their source and their motivation for getting involved in peace building and in trying to resolve this conflict. But they were also frequently told by religious leaders that they should not be involved in public affairs. They shouldn't speak in public, that women had no role in politics. They should not be involved in decision-making about war and peace, issues of war and peace. So how did we, so the women would talk about these kind of issues. And it was always eye-opening to many of the participants to realize that women were across the world and across different regions were facing very similar issues. So how did we incorporate religion into this nonviolence training? We would talk about religious texts that supported peace and justice. There was a lot of talk and sharing about religion and faith as a motivation for peace building and for getting involved in social change movements and justice movements. And this kind of discussion was eye-opening to many of the participants, many of whom were involved in conflicts that were superficially at least seen as religious conflicts, as religious wars. And I can remember doing one training with young Buddhist women, and they were astonished. And one woman was very clear. She said, you know, I never thought that Buddhism could be applied to any kind of social issue or social problem, and definitely not around issues of war and peace. If we were doing a training with Buddhist women, one of the things we could offer were analytical tools. Like I said earlier, how do you analyze a conflict? What causes this conflict? And we realized that the Four Noble Truths was a fantastic, excellent analytical tool for social change. You start with the first noble truth, that there is a conflict. And this is important because in many situations of violence or injustice, the violence is not recognized or it's denied. I know in the United States, after the murder of George Floyd, I did hear some Americans saying that there is no racial problem in the United States. This is a problem of criminals or thugs or a problem of just malcontents. So to actually recognize that there is a violent conflict going on and that it is causing suffering can be very important. Then, of course, trying to analyze what are the causes of the conflict. And then that an end to the conflict is possible. And this, again, was very helpful to a lot of people involved if they were actually in a situation of armed conflict, because the situation can appear hopeless. Many conflicts, I'm thinking of conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and at one point, the generations-long conflict in Northern Ireland between Roman Catholics and Protestant groups. There was really a sense that this conflict would never end, that we could never have peace. Peace was impossible. And then, of course, there are ways to end the conflict. We would also use the bell in the order of interbeing, which I'm a lay member of. The bell is invited before people speak, so you can take a breath. You can think about what you want to say. or you can think about how can I practice some deep listening here. So we would use the bell in trainings and meetings. We would also, at the beginning of every day, we would meditate together. And, or we would at least, we might not call it meditation. It could be just a period of silence or reflection. And I think that meditation is one way of helping people develop some self-reflection, which is really very important for particularly peace activists. And especially if you're working in a situation or in a place that isn't your home country or your own culture. I think that the self-reflection that can develop out of meditation can help you recognize your own limitations, your own needs, and when you might not be listening deeply enough or might be imposing your own needs on the group that you're trying to serve. I also think that the Buddhist idea of impermanence is very, very important. And we would talk about this. And Thich Nhat Hanh has written about this in many of his books, that everything is impermanent, including dictatorial or authoritarian governments. Corruption is impermanent, that these structures can be changed. And again, when you're in a situation where it looks like the government has all the power and it's held all the power for a generation or more, it can appear very hopeless and that the situation can never change. And that's something that peacemakers have to watch out for, falling into despair or falling into a false sense of helplessness. And again, I was interested that in several of the trainings that we did with Buddhist women and girls, I would frequently hear from them afterwards that they thought only monks could meditate, that somehow meditation was not an appropriate tool or practice for women or girls. At these trainings in nonviolence, we would also always talk about gender and how gender is a construct. People make their ideas about gender. And because gender roles are created, they can also be deconstructed and they can change. Gender can be very fluid. One of the reasons we would talk about gender is that when you look at war and the social construct of war and violent conflict, it needs certain gender roles. Those are some of the props that hold up the system of oppression. You need the idea that dominance and control are positive values and that it's a good thing to be dominant and to be able to control others, to have power over others. You need this idea that men are naturally violent, that all men are violent, that they're warriors, that they're active, and that they should have power and control. And of course, binary opposite of that would be women, and associating with women the ideas of passivity and being passive and being nurturers. So basically, with this binary system of gender, you have victims. It's a setup for having victims and victimized and victimizers. And I think that nonviolence is actually a middle way that you can avoid being a victim and you can avoid being a victimizer. I also think that obviously the insights of non-binary and non-gender conforming people and trans people can be very, very helpful as we try to deconstruct these ideas of these binary gender roles. Homophobia, which we did talk about in our trainings, homophobia is a way of sustaining this dichotomy that if someone is afraid of being accused of being gay or being queer or being lesbian, it's a way of silencing them, silencing their peace work. It's a way, it's attacking their identity, and it's upholding this whole dichotomy of men as natural warriors and women as nurturers. We would also, because we were working with primarily for the first 8 years at least with women and girls, we would talk about violence as a continuum. We would always have a section in our trainings about women's human rights. We would talk about how the violence that is private, that is frequently in the home, such as domestic violence, battering women, child abuse, that was connected and it was part of a continuum of violence that also had a public aspect. And that public aspect was frequently some sort of injustice, some sort of oppression, or war. So there was a link between these different types of violences, and that one, the private violence, supported and created a tolerance for this public violence of war. To prepare for this conversation, I was trying to find out more information about what's being done to help queer people who are caught in situations of violent conflict. And the bad news is there wasn't a lot. There is this statement from the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2014, and it talks about the need to devote specific attention to the LGBT population, particularly in post-disaster and post-conflict situations. And they talk about the stigmatization and discrimination results in increased gender-based violence, and which negatively affects LGBT people. And it can deny them what they need to survive in terms of assistance, shelter, and humanitarian aid. So there was also a paper that was published in the Red Cross, International Review of the Red Cross in 2018. And it looked specifically at cases, the Islamic State in Iraq, and talked about the dangers that LGBT plus people faced. And there were two things that in particular, because LGBT plus people were already marginalized and persecuted, when it came to a situation of violent conflict, They did not have the support that of family or of the tribe or of community members that other people might have. And this obviously put their lives more at risk. When I was thinking about this question of queers as peacemakers and queers as in situations of violent conflict, we do have some documentation of what happens to queer people in certain situations of war. There is documentation because some men bravely spoke out about what happened to German men, gay men, during the Second World War, and being forced to wear the pink triangle and being put into camps. There's also some written information about the role of lesbians in the Balkans conflict, because there was a group of lesbians who worked with other women based in Serbia who were trying to help Croatian and Bosnian women during the war. And they wrote about their lives as lesbians during the conflict and about their peace work as lesbians during the conflict. But we need so much more research. And I would really ask all of you, as you work for social change and as you work for peace and justice in your communities, please write your experiences down so that future queers can have this information and draw inspiration and lessons from your work. There is a lot written and more to be written about experiments in engaged Buddhism. And this is a term that Thich Nhat Hanh came up with in the 1960s during the war in Vietnam. And it was during this conflict that he established the Order of Interbeing to bring Buddhism out of the temple and into the streets, to use Buddhist tools and Buddhist approaches directly in addressing social concerns. And there are also groups of Buddhists who are doing engaged Buddhism. One of the groups is called the International Women's Partnership for Peace and Justice. And this was established in Thailand in 2002. They do a lot of trainings that really try to bring together feminism, spirituality, and social activism. And they have from the very beginning, because the group was started by two lesbian women, they have incorporated trainings and about by and for LGBT folk. It was during a 2009 Gay Pride Parade in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand. And the women from the International Women's Partnership for Peace and Justice were also taking part in that parade. And the marchers were attacked and verbally and physically threatened by homophobes. And because of their nonviolence training, because they were trainers themselves, they were able to really cool the situation down. And basically what they did during the Gay Pride Parade, when they were attacked, they sat down and they started meditating. And the fact that they had that training and they felt they knew what they could do really helped cool the situation down. They also have a program called the Buddhist Education for Social Transformation. which again incorporates these three aspects of spirituality, feminism, and activism. There's also Buddhist peace fellowships in different countries. I believe there's one in Australia and there's one in the United States. And currently they have trainings called Block, Build, and Be trainings. And the block represents blocking systemic systems of violence, whether that violence is racism, homophobia, or militarism. Build is how to work together to build more cooperative alternatives for living together and alternatives to violent conflicts. And B is the meditative and the refreshing and the renewal aspect of the trainings. The photograph is from one of their trainings for climate activists. There's also the International Network of Engaged Buddhists. This is also based in Thailand, although there are chapters. I'm not sure of the exact formal way they are organizing, so I don't know if they would call the groups chapters or not. But there are similar groups connected to INOB in 30 different countries, and they work on a wide variety of social issues. One of the founder of the International Network of Engaged Buddhists has said, Buddhism by definition is engaged. Meditation without social engagement is escapism. This is something that Thich Nhat Hanh also talks about. He says that as a Buddhist, you're always engaged because you're always aware of the suffering, in either suffering of yourself or the suffering of others or the suffering of other beings. There's also within the Order of Interbeing a group called Arise, which is a group that is particularly concerned about racism, and the Arise stands for Awakening Through Race, Intersectionality, and Social Equity. They do trainings for sanghas and they hold retreats for trainings on anti-racism, and they hold healing from racism retreats. So I don't know how I'm doing on time, but just some conclusions that Buddhism is a very rich source of inspiration and tools for peace building. And I think that Buddhism has not been explored enough about how it can be applied to social issues. War is a human rights abuse itself, and that it needs to be recognized and addressed. That LGBTQI people have very valuable lived experiences and insights that can be utilized in peace building. That social justice, including gender justice, is essential for building a world without war. That rigid gender roles help sustain both armed conflict and obviously violence against women and against LGBTQI plus people. And I'd like to end with a queero of mine. She was a lesbian American woman named Barbara Deming, who was very active in the American Civil Rights Movement and later in different pacifist movements. And she had a typical Buddhist insight that we are all part of one another and we need to take care of each other and listen to each other. So those are some resources, different groups about engaged Buddhism. if you're, yeah, if you're interested. So that's about all I have to say.